So just as we can declare the background of an element to be solid color or a color with alpha utilizing CSS, we can also declare that a background is a gradient. Creating gradients by using CSS as opposed to an image file is actually better for both performance and control. Gradients typically are one color that fade into another, but in CSS we can control every aspect of how that happens, from the direction to the colors, and you can use as many as you want to where those color changes actually happen. So let's look at that. I'm going to be working on the same file that we were working in the last exercise, and when we declare gradients, we're going to use the background image property. So when we declare solid colors, we use background color. When we want to declare gradients, we're going to use background image. We can also use the shorthand of just the background property. The most common type of gradient that you can create is the linear gradient. This is a gradient where the axes go from left to right or top to bottom or at any angle that you choose. If you don't declare an angle, it's going to assume top to bottom. So let's go ahead and create a gradient, and I'm just going to use these same boxes that I utilized in the last exercise. I'll leave the background color there just as a fallback color in case the browser is not able to understand my background image. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set the background image, and I need to specify the type of gradient that I want to use. I'm going to use linear gradient, and then in the parentheses I'll pass on the colors that I want to use. And you can use hex values here, you can use color keywords, you can use a combination, you can use your RGBA or your HSL, any of the properties that you normally use. I'm going to save this page and let's look at it in the browser. You can see that my first box here is now fading from blue to yellow. It's making a beautiful transition between the two colors. If we want to make the gradient go from left to right, we need to pass on an additional parameter in the beginning of the linear gradient. So I'm going to put linear gradient, and then in the parentheses prior to putting the colors I'm going to put to right, comma, and then I'll pass on the color values that I want. If I save my page now and we look in the browser, you can see that now the transition occurs from left to right instead of from top to bottom. This to syntax also works for corners. So if I wanted the axis of the gradient to start at the bottom left corner and go to the top right corner, we would say something like top right. And you can see that now the gradient goes from the bottom left to the top right. Now because I'm using a square box right here, the angle of the gradient is at 45-degree angle. If the box was not a square and the angle wasn't at a 45-degree angle, you could actually declare the angle that you want the gradient to occur. So instead of top right, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to specify the angle. So let's just put something like 60, and you pass on DEG for degree. And if we save now and we look in the browser, you can see that the angle of my gradient has changed slightly. Instead of going from here to here, it kind of goes from here to here. In addition to what we've just done, we're not limited to two colors. We can have as many comma separated colors as we want. So you would just continue to pass those on. So I just would put a comma in there, and if I wanted to use RGB this time, I would use RGB. I'd put my parentheses. I'd go ahead and put in the values for my color. And these can be separated by spaces or not. That's going to be up to you. But if we look at our gradient now, you can see that I have a multicolor gradient that's going from blue to orange to yellow to purple. I'm just going to copy this rule right here, and let's go ahead and let's add it to one of these other boxes, and we'll change our gradient a little bit. I'm going to make a linear gradient, but let's change this to go to right, and I'll pass on colors like red, and then I'm going to put comma orange, and I'm going to put 10%. When I add percent after the color, this is creating a color stop, and let me show you what the results are going to look like. You can see now that my gradient goes from red to orange, but the transition occurs very, very quickly, and that's because I put this color stop in here. I put it at 10% of the width of the box, so the transition occurs at 10%. By taking advantage of these color stops, you can actually simulate columns with CSS. This can be really useful if you wanted to make a full height background that inserted color all the way down, no matter what the height of the containing element might be. So let's change what this says a little bit here. I'm going to make my gradient go from left to right again. I'm going to specify my first color, and I'll use the blue hex value. Then I'm going to plug in that exact same color again, and I'm going to give it a % value. Then I'm going to immediately declare my next color, and I'm going to utilize the same % value. This is going to make the transition occur immediately. There's not going to be a fade between the two colors. The color is just going to go from being blue to orange. And then I'm going to specify where I want the orange color to end. And then I'm going to use my 069, my blue color again, and I'll just tell that to also occur at 80% so that I have a distinct transition between the colors. Let me show you what this gives us when we look at it in the browser. You can see how I get these striping types of techniques. So that's a pretty cool method of creating multiple colored columns. Even though this is just one column, I'd have to put things inside it and restrict their width if I wanted it to kind of create multiple columns, but at least this mimics that kind of look. Now let me just take you to Can I Use, and we're going to search for gradients. And you can see for CSS gradients, and this allows you to define linear or radial gradients. We'll look at radial gradients in a minute. The support is pretty good in the modern browsers. There are issues with IE9 and earlier versions, and some of the older Android browsers still require the WebKit prefix to be able to successfully apply the gradients. So when you do apply gradients like this, you're going to want to include fallback content, which would just be some sort of solid color, or perhaps even using an image. And possibly, if you're trying to gain support for some of these older browsers, you may need to put the vendor prefix in there. Let me show you how we can create a radial gradient. So here in my third div tag, I'm going to create a radial gradient. So again, I'll just leave this color there as the fallback color. I'm going to use background image. And instead of specifying linear gradient, I'm going to specify radial gradient, and then in the parentheses I'll just put the colors that I want. So we'll just use keyword colors here. And if I save and we refresh our page in the browser, you can now see that I get a radial or sunburst type of gradient. Let's change this color to red just so that the transition is a little bit more apparent. When you view this, you can see how the gradient makes a radial type of shape. If my div was more of a rectangle, and let me just change this div, we'll change the height on it to be 75 pixels. You can see that in addition to the box becoming smaller, the gradient also gets squished and it fills as an ellipse. If we wanted this to still fill as a circle, we can pass on that property as well. So in addition to having radial gradient and then specifying the colors, before we specify the color, I would put the shape that I want the gradient to be. So in this case, if I put circle, let me show you how that's going to change how the gradient fills this space. So you can see that now it stays as a circle. It fades all the way to the ending color along the furthest edge. The other thing we can do is we can change the default center of a radial gradient. By default, they always start in the center of the object that they're filling, but we could offset that in a similar way that we offset the linear gradients. If I add to my value here, circle at top right, now when we view the gradient in the browser, you can see how it's shining down from the upper right hand corner. So there's all sorts of fun things that you can do by utilizing gradients. What we're going to be doing now is we're going to finish up our file that we were working on in a previous lesson, and we're going to convert it so that these comments now have gradient fills. We left off and the file looked like this. So let's just put our new gradient-based knowledge into this page so that we can take advantage of that and just make this page look a little bit more slick. So to add this frosted gradient to the file that we're using, I'm going to add this property to my list item that I already have. I'll leave the background color here because I want this to be the fallback content, so in case the gradient is supported, at least it will fill with the burgundy mauve color. I'm going to use the background image property, and I'm going to specify that I want to create a linear gradient, and then inside of the parentheses I'm going to pass on the colors that I want. I'll be using RGBA colors, and inside of my RGBA colors I'm going to pass on the values that I want. I am going to just create a white frosting, so I'm going to use 255, 255, and 255, and I'll use 0.7, so 70% for the opacity. After the closing parentheses for the RGBA value, I'm going to use a comma, and then I'm actually going to have this gradient go from 70% white to 0% white. So I'll use the exact same value, except that I'll change the opacity to 0. And let me just make sure I put my semicolon so that the rest of my rules are respected. And when I save this page, if we go back into the browser and refresh the page, you can now see that I get kind of a frosting type of effect on all of my list items. So in this way, I'm able to style these list items with a gradient that gives them a little bit more depth and a little bit more interest than just the flat colors that were there before. Obviously there's all sorts of ways that you can incorporate gradients into your project. I just wanted to make you aware of some of the methods that you could use and to show you how you could use it to add a little bit more polish to a web page that you may be working on.